that's why I decided to, if I was going to, my contribution to the world was going to be writing code. I wanted as much of the code as possible to be open source because that felt like it was contributing to humanity's foundation in a way, versus, just something that ends up proprietary on some server in some company somewhere.
Today on the Eric Ries Show, I am joined by a true internet pioneer, Matt Mullenweg, co-founder of WordPress and founder of Automattic. In this episode, we go deep into the 20-year journey of building Automattic, from turning down a $200 million acquisition offer with just 20 employees to shaping one of the most resilient, mission-driven companies on the web. Matt shares what it means to create software that's built to last generations and why trust, open source, and long-term thinking are the ultimate competitive advantages. Chances are you've touched something that Matt helped build. WordPress now powers over 40% of all websites globally. And, as it happens, today is the 20th anniversary of the founding of Automattic, one of the most contrarian, unusual, and interesting companies on the entire internet. Our conversation spans the full 20-year history of WordPress and Automattic, starting from how it began to its many different phases, its recent controversies, and even the new products they're working on, things like Beeper, which aims to unify all your messages into one encrypted app. Automattic was one of the first all-remote companies long before the pandemic and has been a pioneer of a number of transparency, authenticity, and open principles that many companies aspire to and quite a few have copied. I know you're going to learn a ton from my conversation with Matt Mullenweg. Matt, thank you so much for doing this interview. It's always a pleasure to see you.
Likewise.
I'm especially honored that today, when this episode is being released, is the 20th anniversary of Automattic. And let's start with that. How does it feel to be 20 years into this journey? I can't even imagine what that must be like.
It feels like we're just getting started. And, gosh, so much has changed in the past 20 years since Automattic began. And I always wanted to build a company that could be generational, that could, not just survive, but thrive through several large technology shifts. And we've had a few since 2005, when there was no iPhone or, JavaScript on the web was very clunky and all these sorts of things. So a lot has changed since then. And now with AI, it feels kind of like day one. Not to plug one of our products called Day One, but
that's okay. It's okay. It's a podcast. It's okay.
It's it feels very, very exciting.
So take me back in the time machine, because it's interesting that you started already with the question of being a generational company and having that ambition. And I'm curious why. Why is that important to you? And was that something that you were consciously aware of even 20 years ago?
Well, I think it's also, inherent to what WordPress is. So, WordPress started before Automattic, and a content management system needs to store your stuff very well and hopefully forever, right?
Ideally,
so how do you build software that's very robust that can, WordPress stores all the revisions, so it tracks every change to every page or post and things like that. So, that sort of integrity of data, got me thinking about long-standing institutions. I got involved with the Long Now Foundation, which is a very cool foundation, which sort of works on these sorts of things. Yeah, in the beginning, to be honest, probably the ambitions were modest at the beginning. And perhaps I thought maybe, we'd sell in a year or two or something. But then, it was about 2 or 3 years after we started where we actually did get an offer to sell for $200 million.
Oh, wow.
We were just about 20 people.
This episode is brought to you by Ahrefs. If you run a website, I'm sure you check your traffic. Heck, I remember when Google Analytics first came out. It was an incredible advance. But these days, we have worries about privacy, about how bloated it's become and how delayed the data is. Ahrefs Web Analytics is a free, privacy-first alternative built for simplicity and speed. We're talking about instant insights on website traffic, top pages, where visitors come from, and what devices they're using. No cookies by default, no personal data collected, just the essentials without the noise. Skip the complexity, respect your customer's privacy, and still know exactly what's happening in real time. Get instant website traffic and sign up for free at hrefs.com/web-analytics. That's hrefs.com/web-analytics.
And turning that down was a real inflection point for the company, because it's like, if you're saying no to this, what are you saying yes to?
That's just what I was going to
And
ask you. Yeah, how, like, walk me through what that meeting was like. I mean, not just for you, but for your whole team.
yeah, so to sort of set the stage, we had launched Akismet, our first project, and then WordPress.com. We were probably right around 20 people, and also starting to experience some of the first frictions of a startup, where like people aren't getting along and things like that. So it was actually like a turbulent time, and this sort of offer had come in to a bit of a roll up, and it would have meant, because we just raised our Series A, which was, I guess you now would call it pre-seed. It was 1.1 on 3.3.
I was just trying to explain to a founder yesterday what Series A used to mean not that long ago. Yeah, they found that hard to imagine.
Yeah, we've exhausted the alphabet a little bit, but yeah, that was our Series A, and so it would have meant for me walking away with 100 million in cash and a lot of equity in this new thing. And I was like, wow, that was kind of like the dream. I started this thing, but that's when I realized, like, it wasn't about like, well, if I had $100 million, what would I want to do? Well, I'd want to work on WordPress. I'd want to go to WordCamps. I'd want to meet users. I'd want to, do kind of what I was doing already.
Yeah.
And I started thinking, if you say no to this, what are you saying yes to? And it was to, I think that was the inflection point where we said, okay, we're going to build this into something that's actually big, that becomes a serious player on the internet and part of sort of the infrastructure of the internet. If we really want to, at the time, WordPress probably powered 0.8% of websites. But we were saying, well, perhaps we can create the software that does become a standard, like a web operating system, if you will.
How'd your investors feel about turning down all that money? It must have been a very quick win for them if you'd said yes.
They were fantastic, actually. So we used that that offer became a valuation for a Series B into the company.
I see. So you did that instead.
And it was unusual at the time. It's common now, but they actually did a bit of secondary. So they allowed me to take a little money off the table. So I was able to, not be just ramen living anymore. And then, we put money into the company and sort of started building, the platform, thinking of WordPress not just as a blogging tool, but really as a content management system, a platform that you could build other applications on top of, and yeah, took off.
So it's, one of these, yet another open source, overnight successes, how many years in the making. And so go back in the time machine a little bit more for me, because I think people, today WordPress is synonymous with Automattic, but I think people don't actually really know the story of how the open source project actually came first. So talk a little bit about first of all, most people who start an open source, well, most people never even start an open source project. And of the people that do, very few of those open source projects ever get any kind of traction. And of the ones that do, very few of those actually manage to become like a company, that does something more significant than just maintain this open source project. So just like, how did you wind up navigating those decisions, starting with just why even start an open source project in the first place?
Why open source in the first place? Well, as a kid, I kind of got radicalized into open source because it was free and cheap and easy, and the communities were so welcoming. They didn't care that I was like an 18 or 19-year-old kid in Houston who had no comp sci degree or anything like that. They would just look at your code
I
and
remember, yeah.
and what you did. So
because on the internet, no one knows you're a dog or a kid. Yeah, that That was very
Exactly.
important to me in the early internet too.
I was young and I looked even younger. So it was, you know, there was before I had the ability to grow facial hair and things. Um,
Well, we
the
didn't Zoom. We didn't Zoom back then, so you didn't have to do video calls. So
That's true.
no
Yeah,
one had any way of knowing. Yeah.
yeah. Using what now seems like fairly primitive technology like SourceForge and IRC and things like that. Um, yeah, I had started using different web scripts to run websites, and I come across one called B2 cafelog, which is actually the sort of original code that WordPress was based on.
Hmm.
Um, so B2 cafelog was founded by a guy named Michel Valdretti in Corsica, France, and yeah, it was great. It wasn't uh, the most popular thing at the time was called movable type, which was
Hmm.
written in Perl, and also Blogger was out there, and there was a lot of other. Dave Weiner had his stuff. There was a lot of other blogging solutions, but I liked PHP because it could run easily on any hosting account. Um, and I liked the code, and so I started contributing sort of to this community. I would go on the forums and answer questions. First, I started asking questions, and then I went back and started helping other people answer questions. Started to publish code patches to improve B2, contribute some code to it, and what happened was the developer, the lead, kind of disappeared, and there was a bit of a vacuum, and no one knew what the future of B2 Cafe Log would be. And so there were about, I think, 5 or 6 different forks that sort of sprung out of B2. And a fork is when you take open source code and you sort of use the code, but then rename it to something else, and sort of go on a new path.
Like a new evolutionary path, a new mutation that leads to a new species. Yeah.
It's very Darwinian, yeah. um, so there were 4 or 5 different forks, and I did this blog post where I talked about my blogging software dilemma, where I wanted something with like the sort of elegance of something called text pattern, which was my favorite at the time, but it was
Mhm.
proprietary. Um, Sort of like pluggability of movable type, the ease of use of Blogger, and the hackability of B2. And this guy, like I think a day or two later, named Mike Little in the UK, who was another volunteer and contributor to B2, left a comment and said, "Hey, if you want to work on this, I'm interested." And so that's literally how WordPress started. You can go and look at the blog post in the comment today. It's still up there.
We'll link to it in the show notes. People need to look at this because if he hadn't messaged you, do you think you would have done it?
That's a good question. I don't know. Yeah, there's definitely that. I feel like everything in my life I've always done with other people.
Hmm.
It's never been a solo thing. I like working with others, and Mike was fantastic. He was a lot older than me, much more experienced developer, and he had some cool. He had this cool thing called B2 links, which was like a way to put like links in your sidebar for B2. And so it's like, okay, let's start hacking on it.
Yeah.
I was going to these blogger meetups at the time, sort of around Houston, and my friend Christine Chermule came up with the name WordPress. She called me. It's like, call it WordPress. And the domains .org's available. And so I was like, oh, cool. And I registered it, went and registered the domain, and that sort of we were off to the races.
I love that story so much. Obviously I've heard you tell it before, so it's not new to me. But I think it's important because contra the popular culture idea that startups emerge fully formed from the founder's head through this like miraculous vision birthing process. Like they generally are birthed out of a community in which the founder plays like a catalyzing or almost like a crystallizing role. They become the figurehead of the thing, and obviously the story gets retold around them. and their personal charisma and whatever else is important to the story later. But I appreciate you kind of telling the actual story, which is so often the case where like an early customer or some, just like someone in the community, or like, yeah, it's just like somehow the pieces come together and it all works out. But it's very rarely part of a like 100% master plan by an individual person. Is that how you see it now? Like, do you have that feeling about it, that like you were in some ways an instrument of this larger community to do this thing, or how do you feel about it?
I also love jazz and came out of jazz. And, you know, um, yeah, I feel like the creative act of making great software is kind of like the creative act of jazz, where, the best stuff comes from the interaction between people. You riff off each other.
Totally.
Um, Ideas kind of pass between different musicians. It's I do very much enjoy working in teams, and I do think it's important not just to build a product, but to build a community.
Yeah.
Have like a ethos, a point of view, reason to exist. Um,
Explain
because
ethos. Ethos is such a key word, I think, to projects like this. What does it mean to have an ethos? And what was the one you settled on for WordPress in those days?
so there are a few different layers actually. So I mean, the first and foremost was the GPL. So that's an open source license, which guarantees certain freedoms to the users. Four freedoms: the freedom to see how the software works,
Mm-hmm.
the freedom to modify the software, the freedom to distribute those modifications, and I think did I get I'm missing one.
It's okay. Wait a minute. Wasn't that
See how
you
it
just
works, modify it, redistribute it. Yeah, I'm missing one. But there's four freedoms of GPL. So that was one layer. The second layer, I would say, was a new movement at the time, which was around web standards. So this idea that HTML code could be written to sort of a standard
mm-hmm.
versus being sort of targeted to different browsers like Internet Explorer or uh, Mozilla or whatever that was at the time. Um, you could have a standard set of HTML code and sort of driven by this organization called the W3C.
Mm-hmm.
And WordPress was very, very into creating standards compliant code, which was unusual at the time. And then finally, we tried to put a little bit of a jazz on it. So, we had this tagline, code is poetry.
Mm-hmm.
The idea that, it's not just code, it can be beautiful as well.
Mm-hmm.
And not the first release, but I think starting with like the second release, we started naming every release after in honor of a jazz musician,
Mm.
and we've done that now for 60 releases.
Who did you pick first?
Ooh, who was first? The very first release, yeah, Miles Davis, January 3rd, 2004.
2004. Yeah.
Miles Davis, Charles Mingus, Billy Strayhorn, Duke Ellington, Ella Fitzgerald, Stan Getz, Dexter Gordon. We were pretty stacked in the beginning.
You start with the all greats. Yeah, it's not, but I'm surprised Coltrane didn't make the top 10. That's
He
seems
was
like
2.7.
okay. All right. It's fair. I'm glad you talked about standards actually, because that's one of the things I wanted to talk to you about. And this is kind of like in the category of advanced company building technique that a lot of founders do not understand. Because when we talk to people about standards as a like business strategy, people like, first of all, usually don't have any idea what I'm talking about. But if they do think about it at all they can imagine is creating their own new standard and forcing other people to comply with their standard, which of course is one of the things you can do with standards. Following somebody else's standard, like supporting a standard that you think is the right thing, as you did, with web standards at a time when that was not the common practice. That turned out to be a really important part of what became the ethos of WordPress that, I certainly feel like is a big part of why you are where you are now. So talk a little bit about the decision, like the willingness to endorse a different standard that you yourself did not create and control. And why was that an important part of the ethos?
I think a big part of the ethos was interoperability.
Mm-hmm.
So, um, this idea of web standards really popularized by Jeffrey Zeldman in a lot of ways with the Web Standards Project was to, yeah, you could write because I feel kind of old saying this, but like there used to be sometimes two versions of a site. So you'd visit a site and
Mhm.
then you'd click on like the Internet Explorer version or like this
The
Safari
Netscape Navigator
version,
version, yeah.
Netscape version or something. Yeah. So there'd be like, you'd have to code it twice. And
Yeah.
that obviously to an engineer uh, feels like a travesty, like
No, the
terrible.
inefficiency of it is terrible.
Um, there was also the other funny thing that was happening at the time was there was competing RSS standards. Dave Weiner invented RSS, and then there was a competing standard that was based on RDF, and then Dave Weiner came out with RSS 2.0, and then there was this thing called Atom.
Atom, yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, I was saying, what about Atom?
Um, so again, in WordPress, because we were a fully dynamic system, we ended up just supporting all of them. We made the defaults RSS 2.0, which kind of felt like the most uh, sort of core and original to Dave's vision, and really, and that then became the basis of podcasting, by the way, which is kind of fun.
Yeah, almost every person listening to this is using RSS 2.0 to do so, without whether they know it or not. Yeah.
Yeah, it's really amazing what that little spark created.
And every time you hear a podcast host say, you can get this episode anywhere you listen to podcasts, instead of having to say, you can find me on the Apple App Store or find me at this particular place, like there's actually an incredible amount of infrastructure and open source and standards behind that simple phrase. That is why podcasting is such a domain of total freedom, because it's
Yeah,
not controlled by any central player.
yeah. RSS stands for really simple syndication, I believe. Um, so
It
yeah,
was quite the
it's
MVP when it was conceived and has come so far. Yeah.
these things I think are really important and something that uh, you know I think in various seasons of technology
Yeah.
um, we sometimes lose sight of the importance of interoperability and hackability and open APIs and everything like that. Open
It's a
source,
it's a huge issue right now. I mean, like, not
absolutely.
to get into current events, but yeah, we seem to be in a very much in the wrong phase of that cycle with a lot of things right now.
But when you get back to customers, when you get back to users, what do they want? They want the freedom. they want to be able to own their data. They want to be able to modify things. They want to all of the things that sort of are at the basis of open source. That's why I decided to, you know, if I was going to, my contribution to the world was going to be writing code. I wanted as much of the code as possible to be open source because that felt like it was contributing to humanity's foundation in a way, versus just something that ends up proprietary on some server in some company somewhere.
Yeah, I first of all, I really appreciate that you had that ethos, because I've done a lot of good in the world, but I really think it's still pretty widely misunderstood. And I think part of it, of course, is like Richard Stallman turned out to be kind of a controversial figure, and like the open source free software fights and all this stuff. Like, there's been a lot of churn around it, but I think that there's a deeper issue, and I want to get your take on it because I think you're one of the few people that really has, for a really long time, been able to blend that ethos as an engineering matter with a business strategy, a business philosophy that has created a lot of value, for you and for the world. And the four freedoms is such a profound framework, but in business, and I think in engineering, we have kind of come to understand it as something fundamental, and we should name the four freedoms properly, because I think we got confused because they're numbered at number 0 to start with, of course, as an
It's
RMS
the
special.
freedom
That's
to
why
run software for any
run
purpose.
the
That's the
software
one.
first, then to copy, then to modify, then to
Yeah,
redistribute your
that's the one I forgot.
modifications. Yeah.
That's kind of like the freedom of speech one. It's like the one you can use the software for anything. You can use the
Yeah,
software
exactly. And
to
I
say
bring that up
WordPress is
because
terrible. You could use it to say I'm terrible. I can't control how you use this.
100%, 100%. Because that actually used to be very controversial. Like, that had to be one of the freedoms, because proprietary software vendors used to believe regularly and regularly believe they had to be able to control who and when was allowed to use the software under what circumstances. And periodically, software technology companies in general rediscover the fact that the technology makes it possible to control usage to a shocking degree, and sometimes even to charge for that control and to do all kinds of exploitative things. And what I think is really interesting is like, I don't think as a industry, the business philosophy of this has caught up to the technology understanding, the engineering understanding in this very specific concrete way that when you embrace standards, when you embrace open standards, when you give the software away for free. I remember people used to talk about how crazy that is. You're gonna give it away for free? How can that possibly be right? Surely that's not the profit maximizing thing to do. But when you do all those things, when you embrace doing right by customers, you allow them to trust you in a way that is simply not possible in a more exploitative relationship. And I wonder if you could just talk about trustworthiness as like a strategic asset, as a source of strength in the company that you wound up building, and not just as a part of the ethos of the open source project.
Well, I think it's really just at the core of engineering, right? If you think of the idea of engineering, let's talk about something like if you're an engineer on a bridge, right? You have a responsibility to build that bridge in a way that it will allow people to drive on it and not crash and everything like that. Um, so a lot of what engineers do is often hidden or behind the scenes. Maybe people don't see it or appreciate it, but I think is driven by a very deep sort of almost like code of ethics um, to serve the greatest utility. Um, for me, that means open source, and a lot of why open source has grown isn't because there's consumer demand for it. I don't think there's a I wish there were, but
Mhm.
I don't think there's like a worldwide movement of people saying I must use open source software. Um, but what's happened is like behind the scenes, a bunch of engineers, myself and many, 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 many others,
Yeah.
um, have basically said, okay, we're going to give you the thing you want, and we're going to make it open source behind the scenes. So it has all these freedoms, and hopefully you never need them. Hopefully, like you don't have to worry about it. But if things ever go wrong or something, you have kind of
Sure.
this bill of rights attached to the
It
software.
comes in handy at certain key moments. It must be the world's most quiet revolution,
Open source
ever.
has taken over the world.
Yeah, yeah, it's like it's completely ubiquitous, and it's mostly done in ways that people do not understand. It rarely gets written about. It doesn't get nearly the heraldry you would expect, and yet it's had this really profound impact. Every people's lives depend on it to a degree they have no idea. You have no idea how many open source maintainers are keeping the computer you rely on for your job running, and the infrastructure you use for so many things. It's it makes your car go. It's hardly any products left in the world that are not a little open source software powering them in some way.
There's definitely open source in some part of almost every technology you touch.
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure of that, whether it's SQLite or something like that.
Oh, yeah. Oh, people have
It's
no
everywhere.
idea how frequently embedded these things are. I want to press you on this point a little bit because one of the things that I really remember, like if I think about the shift of these 20 years, and you've always had the closest look at it, I can remember there was a time when using open source software was controversial. Forget releasing your own source code. I can remember being told by investors and even by lawyers, just using open source software is kind of like, I don't know, are you sure? Do you really have the rights to that? Is that going to be okay? Like, shouldn't you have, own and have proprietary, control over absolutely every aspect of your stack? And now that pendulum has swung so far that now we have companies who actually are doing exploitative things to open source and like stealing open source projects and just commercializing them and doing all kinds of stuff. I know you've had to deal with that kind of nonsense yourself. But first, like talk about that shift from just like the inability of people to comprehend using open source to it becoming ubiquitous. As an open source vendor yourself, like how's that felt? And how would you kind of talk about that shift over 20 years now?
Yeah, I'm not an expert on this, and I was young when it happened, but I think around 2000, there was a sort of concerted effort by some proprietary companies like Microsoft to
Yeah.
demonize open source as like
Yeah,
something
this
that
was the
was
old Microsoft, the better
insecure,
days, yeah.
um, would create legal liabilities for your company, things like that. Um,
The old fear,
so
uncertainty, and doubt, as we used to call it.
now some of this was fair in that these licenses were novel. I mean, they were new, and it took a few years for them to be tested in courts. But they were, and they held up, and so that's been fantastic. there was this idea that code being secret makes it more secure.
Yeah. The old security through obscurity. Yeah.
Security through obscurity. And there's, you can kind of, that sort of seems like it makes sense, but there's just so many counterexamples as well. That, we can all think of proprietary software that's had security bugs in the past, Windows famously, or Microsoft, or other things. Um, and, in open source, at least, you can see what's going on. And the idea is that with lots of contributors, they say with many eyes, all bugs are shallow. So this idea that with lots of people looking at the code
Mm-hmm.
and actually seeing how it works, that is more trustworthy than sort of a black box where you just have to trust that this proprietary black box of code
That is
is
the magic
honest.
word. And you now see products like WordPress or MySQL, or you mentioned SQLite. So many projects that at the time they were started had many competitors, open source and proprietary. And here you are 20 years later, still standing. How many projects have come and gone in that time? How many proprietary companies have come and gone in that space in that time? It must be dozens or hundreds. I can't even count.
A lot, and we still have great competitors starting up every day.
Yeah, yeah, and
That's what's kind of fun about it. Technology
no,
is like
I
you
love
can
that,
never rest on your laurels. There's always
and
someone
yet
new.
and yet when people think about doing this themselves, or they talk, you go to an MBA program and they analyze these things. You talk to investors about it. They like, this fact is so obvious. It's like staring us all in the face, that by being the most trustworthy provider, you can become the de facto standard and have this tremendous competitive success. And yet, in the face of that, people still say, I don't know. Are you sure you want to give it away for free? Maybe, why don't you put that decision off until later, start on the proprietary path, and you can always, you can always figure it out later. You
Well, it
must,
brings
you
us
must counsel a
into
lot. You invest in startups, you counsel people about it. You must encounter this same line of thinking.
yeah. I was going to say it brings us into sort of an area that is getting more attention recently, which is sort of like the sort of funding and sustainability of open source software.
Yeah, yeah.
So sometimes we have pieces of open source software that are like crucial building blocks of the internet, or like everything uses it, but it's, one guy out in Nebraska
Yeah, no one's willing to pay
without
to
a
have it be
funding or something.
maintained.
And so um, definitely, I think companies, everyone is thinking now more about how, hey, if we're using this software, how do we also contribute back to it? How do we maybe, test it or review it or contribute code or money or whatever it is that like sort of improves that foundation? It's voluntary, it's not like you're paying for software, but you're paying to make the thing that you
You
rely on
yourself
better.
rely on better. Yeah, it's actually like, it's a form of public good investment. That
Exactly.
if we taught business properly, it would be very obvious that that's a high ROI thing to spend money on. That's my view.
I believe in the long term it is. In the short term, though, it just looks like you're burning cash. Probably you're
Totally.
throwing it
Well,
in.
yeah, if business was only conducted in the short term, then it would be really easy. Yeah, no kidding.
Yeah, weren't you involved with like long term stock exchange
I
or?
created the long-term stock exchange, so you're singing my tune. Absolutely. No, that's no, because we have to have. I mean, we have to have a place where companies with an ethos can go public and not have what's happened to so many happen to them. So to me, this is a really urgent problem. This is just one instance of the fact that we've just created a culture that incentivizes short-term thinking in so many places in ways, and from your time at the Long Now Foundation, like, is actually really corrosive to the project of civilization.
I actually think in technology, the big companies are actually quite good at this, though.
Hmm.
Um, Lots of them have amazing research. Actually, what's changed incredibly. Even Microsoft now is like one of the biggest open source
Hmm.
contributors.
Hmm.
Meta and Facebook has like created a tremendous amount of open source that's used by countless other companies, things like React and others.
Oh yeah, and it's
So
become part of their competitive strategy in ways that would have been unthinkable 20 years ago, especially the old Microsoft. That would have been unimaginable state of affairs.
absolutely, with their acquisition of GitHub, I think they really laid a stake in the ground there. So it's
Can you imagine if they had acquired SourceForge? What a on who that would
back
have
in the
been, right?
day.
Like we've changed, things have changed so much.
Yeah, SourceForge was for people listening, was kind of like GitHub
The GitHub of its time, yeah.
of its time, based on a source control system called CVS.
So I want to try a prediction on you. I was thinking about it as I was thinking about, I knew we were going to have this conversation. And I've been thinking a lot about open source lately. And as I said, of standards and how that applies in business. And I think sometime in the future, I don't know if we're talking about 20 years from now, or I don't know what the time horizon for this is, but I think there will come a time when the change that we've seen where like using open source went from controversial to just now it's completely obvious. Like, have you ever met us? If a startup pitched you now and they're like, we refuse to use any open source software, you just be like, you're completely doomed. What are you talking about? I think creating and releasing open source software is going to be like that sometime in the future. Like people are going to realize that the benefits of doing it, like even if all you care about is your own selfish, business success and are not interested in the four freedoms in particular or social, whatever, like even just as a business strategy matter, it's going to be seen as like really obvious that of course you would do that. Because of course you want to maximize how much trustworthiness you have so that you can ruthlessly crush your competitors. Why would you want to let a competitor be the one who sets the standard? Oh no, that would be terrible. What do you think? Does that strike you as plausible, my prediction?
I do think a larger and larger percentage of all software in the world will become open source. It'll never be 100%. There's always reasons for some things to be proprietary. And I fully support the freedom of developers to publish under whatever license they
Mm-hmm,
want.
mm-hmm.
But yeah, for my sort of corner of the internet, we're choosing to do it the GPL way, and I like that because it does become a building brick. One of the crazy things about open source is like you never know how someone's going to use it, and so that's part of what allows so much innovation, almost like a Cambrian explosion of you know things that happen when there's a successful open source project. The stuff that gets built on top of it is far beyond what the creator could have ever imagined or done, and it gets hacked and used in all sorts of weird ways um, that you never would have imagined. For WordPress, that's been as varied as WooCommerce, which is an e-commerce platform built on top of WordPress. I
Mm-hmm.
never would have thought there'd be 30 billion of goods and services being sold every year through through WordPress
Yeah.
with a WooCommerce plugin. Or even just the other day, there's this sort of signal gate thing where I guess there's this service called telemessage.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. Sure.
This was in the news the other day. And people analyzed their website, and it turned out their user registration was going through like WordPress and a plugin called Gravity
War,
Forms.
war plans were being shared through WordPress, through WordPress plugins. Oh, good Lord.
Somehow, this messaging app used it in like a headless way.
Oh
Uh,
my God. I
Basically,
did
there's a
not,
way to
I
use
didn't know
the
that. Oh,
script
that's
with an
hilarious.
API, and so
Oh my God.
they were apparently doing that. So I was like, oh wow, we're in the news.
I want to run another analogy by you that was like maybe this is too spurious of a connection, but I was studying a guy named Saul Price the other day. He's one of the fathers of modern retail. He's both the reason why Walmart is called Walmart, and he ultimately was the mentor and the person who is behind Costco. Although he's not the original founder of Costco, he was his mentor. And he had this concept that really blew my mind when I learned about it. He called it being a fiduciary to the customer.
Hmm.
Very famously, he refused to take a markup on things he sold in his warehouse stores of greater than 14%. Thought it was, any other savings should go to the customer. He wouldn't sell products that he thought were no good. Like he just had a very, very strong point of view that he's taking care of the customer, and he had a fiduciary duty to do that, like as strong or even stronger than his duty to his stockholders, which, as you can imagine, caused his stockholders in his first company to evict him promptly and then drive it right into bankruptcy. So Costco, in certain ways, Costco is his third try to get this thing embedded, and now, of course, it's a $400 billion company. And I just wondered if that concept resonated with you, like akin to the four freedoms of open source. That there's like an idea that if you're going to build a company, you have this ethical obligation, this like engineering mentality. That's not just to take as much as you can for yourself, but that the purpose of it is to take care of the people that touch it or that use it in some way. Like, how do you think about that?
Well, I think you could look at any business that lasts, and they create more value than they capture.
Mm-hmm. In
And
Tim O'Reilly's phrase, yeah.
yeah, um, oh, Tim O'Reilly, yeah.
Yeah.
The yeah, so I think that's just sort of almost like a physics of business. Um, and there's probably, examples of, companies that don't do that, but they're not around 5, 10, 20, 30 years later.
The physics of business. I like that. What's the equation? What do you view as the element? What are the elemental forces of this physics?
Create more value than you capture. And the story you shared, reminded me of like Jeff Bezos's obsession with customer centricity, which I think works for every business and every entrepreneur. There's I've never seen a business get worse by being less close to the customer. You know,
Yeah, amen to that. Okay, let me take you back now to the start of Automattic, because this is the 20th anniversary, not of WordPress, but of Automattic. And Automattic has always struck me as a bit of a strange company. You've always done things your own way in ways that sometimes have been later vindicated, as everyone now does the things that you what's your controversial practices, and other times I think just you're perfectly comfortable to be genuinely contrarian and do things differently. And I wonder why. Like, we'll get into some of those specific things. I love to hear just your thoughts about it. But first thing was, were you consciously trying to do something different in the creation of the company, or like how did you think about translating that ethos from an open source project into a for-profit corporation?
we definitely were trying to do things differently. Although I will say that Automatic started very modestly, which was it's just like, hey, can me and a few of my friends get paid for working on WordPress? Like, can we essentially like do what we were doing on nights and weekends full time? And it obviously grew a lot beyond that. But
Mhm.
I think a lot of the things that we did early on, like being fully remote and distributed, um, actually were didn't feel strange to us because it had been what we were already doing
Right.
as an open source project. So as an open source project, you're working with random people all over the world who you
Obvious.
don't see every day, and you're using like various online means of communication, and it works. And so that had been going on for decades before Automatic started. And so definitely one of the things that was very much on my mind was it was a small young company with $1.1 million in our Series A. Uh, we couldn't compete head on with the tech giants or these other companies that had way more funding than us. So we'd have to sort of zig where they zagged, or we'd have to do things differently because in a head-to-head fight we'd lose every time. So it's like, all right, um, that sort of first principle of like, okay, what can we do differently, and sort of what works for us just expanded. So again, being fully remote and distributed um, sort of also led itself to finding the best talent all over the world, wherever they are, and not worrying about hiring people who can
Mhm.
commute to your office. Um, we had an office, but it was like there was no one there. It's me and Tony Schneider, who I hired as the CEO a few months later. Um, yeah, so it was one of these things where it's we were trying to build on what had worked for us before, and we got honestly some very fair criticism that like, hey, all these other successful startups were built in a certain way, so you're already trying to do a lot of stuff. Why do this differently? I think we kind of had to lean into it and decide. Uh, By the way, you can build fantastic companies and offices.
Yeah, right.
Many people have done it, and there's some days I wish I could be in an office with all my colleagues because I really
Mhm.
like them. Uh, but the uh, we decided that sort of the benefit of finding the best talent from all over the world. Also, because speed is an advantage, we were basically operating 24/7.
Yeah, you
So
described it, I think, to me as a relay race, like the people in one time zone kind of hand off the project to the people in the next time zone, and
yeah, because
you're
the
always
very
home.
first employee was in Ireland, and so I sort of you know code until like midnight or 1 a.m. when he would get up, and then I'd sort of pass things over to him, go to sleep, wake up, things would come back, So that was actually, uh, that's you can't do that forever, but it was pretty fun when I was working.
So I want to dig into this a little more and kind of maybe even push back slightly, because you describe this, and it's funny, Craig Newmark is the same way. Like so many of the great founders that I've met over the years are kind of like this, where the thing that you did seems to you totally obvious. And so you describe it in a way that's almost like no big deal. Like, you zigged where others zagged. You got this advice to have an office, but of course you didn't do that. But that argument that you laid out, that, well, you're already trying to do something so new, why don't you just do everything else the conventional way? That is one of the worst arguments I ever hear around entrepreneurship. It's just horrendous. And yet the vast majority of founders that I know personally fall for it. Like they don't really have the courage of their convictions, and they kind of just like, they don't have, like, just, they wind up doing conventional things that don't really make sense for their ethos because they're too afraid to do something different. So somehow you guys were immune to that argument for remote work, but then I'm sure for 100 other things too. And I want to know why.
There is definitely an art and science to entrepreneurship. So I'll tell you an example of something that I really wanted to do that an investor talked me out of. I think was a bad idea, which is I wanted to create like this virtual currency, essentially. So there'd be like WordPress coins, and there'd be all this sort of like different stuff.
This is way pre-crypto for those that don't realize the timeline.
It was pre-crypto, yeah. And it's kind of based on the idea of like video games, had a lot of virtual currencies. So the investor said to me, you're doing a lot of things different already. You want to do this differently as well, where like people purchase credits and then they buy the thing, and then like just remove the step, make it a little simpler.
Just buy the thing.
I think that was the right call. So, I think you do have to. It's good to.
Again, I'm going to keep pushing back. Well, how can you tell the difference between the ones where they're right? Like, to me, what's interesting about that argument is it's such a non-argument. Because as you say, sometimes it's the right thing to do to listen to it, and sometimes it's the right thing to do to not listen to it. So in that case, the argument itself is not persuasive. So there must be some other factor. What's the other factor that helps you figure out when should you stay true to your vision and when should you actually listen to that kind of advice?
Well, you can always return to the customer. So,
but your customer doesn't care if you have a remote, if you're all remote or you work in the same office.
They don't, especially on the internet.
Yeah. So why is it so how did you decide to pick that one and not the virtual currency one to stick to your guns on?
Well, for one reason, as I said, we had done it already and it was working. The virtual currency was an entirely new thing.
Purely speculative. Yeah, I do think that's an important factor.
Yeah. And I found the argument of simplification, removing a step, compelling. Because when you can remove steps or clicks, things the user has to do, that's probably better. And that layer of abstraction for us is, we aren't a video game, nor are we like a casino. There's not like really an advantage to creating an abstraction layer between the credits and what you spend to sort of like disconnect them in your mind. It's not like you're purchasing things on WordPress.com every, like day or every 5 minutes or something like you might in a casino or a game or something. You're buying a plan that usually lasts 1 to 3 years. So that I think there's a lot of reasons why sort of thinking from some first principles and also thinking from a customer centric point of view, you can say, okay, what matters to the customer, what is simpler for them, and but you never know, to be honest. And perhaps that virtual currency would have been incredible. Who knows?
Who knows?
Who knows? But I'm kind of glad we didn't do it because, again, we were doing a lot. We had a lot on our plate at the time. And that's always been, I think, one of Automattic's.
Having run a virtual currency myself for many years, I can tell you it is no picnic. So yes, it probably was the right call. Tell me about some other things that you did that you feel like were kind of unusual from a company building perspective.
So things that we're unique about Automattic, where we were based on open source, and people thought if you're open source, no one would pay for it. But so we both showed that people would buy in WordPress plugins and themes and things. They would buy open source code um, and pay for it to support the developers. And you could create SaaS services around it, which we did with WordPress.com, for example. So offering like a hosted version of the open source code. So you can run it yourself or we'll run it for you. Um, there was the remote distributed nature. So we're sort of fully distributed from very early days. Funnily enough, this actually applied to our servers as well, because one of the mistakes I made early on was I blew a lot of money on buying some expensive Dell servers that I then racked in a data center in San Diego, and we quickly outgrew them. And so I was to get more capacity was buying. There was these companies at the time like Server Beach and things that you could pay $99 and get like a little uh, hardware, kind of like pre AWS.
Yeah, before the
For
concept of
EC2.
the cloud was common.
Yeah, you get like a little box somewhere, and they'd spin it up for you and automate it, and you'd log in, and so we ended up being multiple data center from a very early stage, and so all the multi data center replication and cache and validation and everything we ended up writing kind of at the very beginning of WordPress.com, which is pretty unusual because even some very modern things like for example Tumblr is not multi data center today. It's kind of tricky to do. Um, what else? Around I think 2011 and 2012, we moved to paying global salaries.
Mhm.
So when we started, we would pay people sort of like more salaries adjusted for the cost of living in an area or a country, and we got some feedback where people were like, "Hey, I'm doing the same work as them. Shouldn't
And why are
I
they being paid more? Yeah.
same work, same pay?" I'm like, "Oh yeah, same work, same pay. Gosh, people fought for this for like 100 years." Yet, sort of in modern corporations, we have this sort of uh, you know feel of cost of living or whatever we call it, like market forces that says it's fair to pay someone in Alabama differently than someone in California or
Well, it goes back to what we were talking
Texas.
about before, that the ethos is if you can get away with paying someone less, you should. Maybe even you must. You have a fiduciary duty, or you're stealing that money from your shareholders. You could have paid them less.
So there's a moral argument to it. I think there's also a business argument to it, which is, um, if this person's providing an amount of value for the customer, that's what the amount of value they provide for the customer should determine their pay,
Mhm.
not where they live in a distributed organization, at least. Now, if we were Starbucks and we had locations in different places, sure, like maybe adjust it to where the place is. But um, yeah, we're not where our employees could be anywhere. I didn't care where they were. So why should we pay them differently based on where they are? And, this then later meant that all of a sudden, if you become uh, a very, very attractive employer to places in some of these countries where they were paying developers a lot less. And so guess what that means? You're going to get the very, very best people, the ones with the most agency and the most ambition that say, "Hey, I don't want to, make 40K. I'm a really great developer. I should be making a global salary."
Mhm.
And then the ultimate business reason is other companies started to do this too. So there were other distributed companies, remote companies. So, I don't want to lose a great engineer to GitLab or 37 Signals or something because I'm underpaying them. So I do think that market forces are part of what makes, I think, compensation in tech very competitive.
So one of the other things that to me has been really interesting watching you over the years, as a company with an ethos, some people sometimes call it being a mission-driven company. I don't know what language you use internally or you feel comfortable using to describe this style of business as opposed to others. We use the word ethos, so I'll stick with that. Is you have built this community around a standard that you maintain, you contribute to, you take care of, and on occasion, it's put you into conflict with other actors in the ecosystem. You've had to stand up on behalf of the community, and it's like embroiled you in not a small number of controversies and lawsuits and all kinds of stuff. Which we don't need to get in so much the details of that unless you want to. I'm more interested in what's it been like, to have to do that, and like how do you decide when something crosses the line and you're like, no, this is a matter we must address. How do you make those decisions?
I think avoiding legal stuff wherever possible is best. So that would be my first advice. Um, but sometimes, and there are examples where we have been able to use sort of community pressure or something like that to encourage people to do the right thing without ever having to go to the courts
Yeah.
or litigate something. Um, but occasionally, folks might really dig in or do consistently bad behavior for a very long time. And especially with things like trademarks, like if you don't protect it, you lose it.
You lose
So
it. Yeah.
you really have to, you know, actually have to protect it and take steps there. So, um, I would say the metric there is to try to talk things out 99.99999% of the time.
Mm-hmm.
And if hopefully you can maintain good relations and have a conversation about things, that avoids, people spending a lot of money and buying lawyers bigger boats. So uh, that would be my chief advice there.
But you haven't been afraid to do it when it was necessary. And I think a lot of founders shy away from that kind of thing. They can easily frankly be bullied by a private equity firm or a big hedge fund or somebody who's got deeper pockets. I can easily see you saying, you know what, discretion is a better part of valor. Let's give in. You haven't been willing to do that on multiple occasions. Why?
I prefer to compete in the marketplace versus the courtroom. And so it has been rare that Automattic has initiated legal action against others. Even when there was something clearly egregious, like at one point, Wix took some of our open source code and embedded it in a proprietary application. So now some of the calculus at the time, though, was I had like $11 million in the bank and Wix had like 200. They were a public company. So I'm like, oh, wow, gosh, in a war of attrition, like we're going to lose this. And the court system, legal system is very deliberate, very slow. Things take years, cost millions and millions of dollars easily. And there's lots of ways to slow it down and muck it up that lawyers do
We've
and
all
different
been through
things.
that.
So I would say, again, avoiding it, that path whenever you can is ideal. And so, yeah, that's what I try to do wherever possible.
One of the things I think I read about you doing, but I don't know that we've had a chance to talk about it since it happened, is you also have used kind of tools for internal alignment to like really ask people who work for you like to buy in to the ethos, and if not, like made it really easy for them to leave. And I thought, and then talked about it publicly, which I think was really interesting. Also, like to really make clear what you're all about, what you stand for. Like, can you, what prompted you to do it? How did it work? Just talk a little bit about that as an alignment exercise.
Yeah, not an original idea. There's many other companies that have done this, but yeah, last year we did an alignment offer where we offered people 6 months of pay to leave. So just basically saying, hey, like, and it does surprise me, at a company, how many people will stay employed at a company that they don't like the management, don't like the company, things
Totally,
like that.
totally. And it's such a
And
drag on everybody else around them. It's like,
it can be very
why are
demotivating.
you here if you don't want to be
Um,
part of this alignment field that we're part of?
so that was essentially an incentive, like a really large amount of money, half a year's salary, um, to
Why did you
stay.
do it?
And it also caused people to recommit because they're now turning down
Mhm.
half a year's salary to stay.
Why?
And
Why? But I want to know why. Why? What prompted you to do it?
well, we were going through this fight with WP Engine, and it was very controversial. and some people, well, the vast majority of people were very supportive of it, and some people uh, did not like it. Um, some people also just had other things they were going to do. It's not everyone who left was like misaligned or anything.
Mhm.
Some people just took it as a great offer, and then they got another job a month later or something. So there's a number of reasons why people leave, especially when you get into the thousands of people.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, it was interesting. I don't think we'll do one again, but it was an interesting exercise, and I see why companies do buyout offers.
Mhm.
Um, so
Did,
yeah,
did it have a noticeable impact afterwards? Did you feel like things were different?
it did. Um,
How
I would
so?
say that we started moving faster, even though we had fewer people. Um, we had, I think it was around 9% of the company take the offer. Um, so, uh, but it just felt like for those who remained, they one recommitted to the company.
Mhm.
Um, there was sort of less of this sort of passive aggressive, like kind of gunking up the works of the progress that we were making.
Yeah.
And by the way, totally unrelated areas as well, like development and other things. So it did feel like a nice sort of reset for the company.
Yeah. Yeah. Misalignment is just, it's this hidden cost people don't appreciate.
Yeah, and I do think it is one of the most challenging things about a company is how much you have to repeat and reaffirm sort of your mission, your ethos, your reason for being, and honestly, something I think I could be a lot better at. Uh, because again, like you said, some things just feel obvious to me,
Mhm.
and so why repeat them? Why say them again?
You are not alone. Yes. Learning how to document the lore and transmit it is a again, in the topics of advanced topics in entrepreneurship, that's a big one. Really
Absolutely,
important. Bring me up to speed. So you're 20 years in. We've been talking a lot about the early years, but how's it going lately?
it's very exciting. Yeah, Automatic's about a. We publicly say we're about 500 million in revenue.
Hmm.
Um,
Not bad.
from WordPress.com, which we've talked about, we've expanded into e-commerce with WooCommerce. And now a third area, we're trying to, so our mission is democratize publishing, original mission. We
Hmm.
expanded that to commerce. And now the third thing we're trying to democratize is messaging.
Mm.
So we have a new product called Beeper, which is in beta right now, fully launching a little bit later in the year. But basically what it does is it takes all your messaging apps and brings it into one. So Telegram, LinkedIn, Twitter DMs, Instagram DMs, Messenger, WhatsApp, etc. You can have multiple WhatsApp accounts
Hmm.
and brings them all into one app. Uh,
It's
so
a
you
consumer
can,
product or a business product?
I would call it kind of a power user product
Power user. Okay.
because there's a bit of setup. You have to connect each service and everything like that.
Hmm.
Um, Obviously, this is extraordinarily technically challenging because we
Yeah.
basically have to replicate the features and functionality and APIs and connect to all these different networks. But for users, it's quite useful, and you can do fun things like there's just some UI improvements I think are kind of interesting. Like for example, show me all the threads where I've sent a message but there hasn't been a reply back.
Hmm.
Almost everyone has unread, but not like the
Yeah.
sort of I sent
Unreplied.
something and the person hasn't replied yet. Or doing scheduled messages across all services, even some that don't support it. So some fun things you could do, and in the future, also be very excited. So it's all done in a super privacy preserving encrypted way. So all your data is yours, and I'm very excited with that interacting with like local AIs in the future as well.
Hmm.
Because what would it look like if an AI could read all of your conversations, run it locally, suggest things you could reply to, or sort of highlight things? I think that would be really useful. Now, this doesn't apply to everyone. Like, not everyone has so many networks or so many messages that it matters. But I do think there is a, a, a good chunk of users out there in the world. I think it could
Hmm.
be our first product to get like 100 million
Wow.
um, monthly active users. So that would be pretty exciting.
Where are you at on AI? You mentioned it briefly. You're bullish on it. I know. You've talked a lot about AI on the edge, on local inference and compute. On the other hand, there's all this controversy about every single one of the publishers that are built on WordPress, AI has involuntarily trained on all of their writing and data without their
Oh
permission.
yeah.
You're right in the middle of that whole controversy. How are you feeling about it?
Yeah, the whole training thing, I don't know. That's I think is going to work itself out through the legal system, which means it will take years.
Undoubtedly.
Um, but I will say that the utility of the AI tools as they exist today is incredible, and also the open source ones, especially being driven by China uh, with things like Quen and
DeepSeek.
DeepSeek and others that are not just open source, they're open weights. They open source how they train. Like they're really demystifying a lot of the sort of like secret sauce of creating these AIs, these large language models that yeah are getting for me the thing that I'm most excited about probably right now is their impact on engineering and code because I'm seeing um, engineers, not all of them, but like a portion of the engineers that I work with start to really adopt these and find ways to help them make them much more productive. And I'd be very excited in the future to think about things like, AI security scanning all the 60,000 plugins and themes for WordPress
Mm-hmm.
and suggesting patches or things that would take a human 100 years to do. Like perhaps we could throw some computers at it and just automate a lot more and just sort of upgrade the quality and security of everything in the WordPress ecosystem.
Mm-hmm. If someone's watching this right now, listening to this podcast or watching us on video, and they're like, man, I want to do it. I want to do that. I want that life. I want to create an open source company like Automattic. What's your advice for that?
Oh, just start. um, by the way, when WordPress started, there was no indication it was going to be big, and um, and I've had lots of dozens of other things I've tried to start that were total failures.
Mm-hmm.
So I think you just need a lot of shots on the goal, and try different things. Look for something that's your own personal passion or something that you need to exist in the world. I think is always a great place to start, and then be as close to customers as possible. Check out the Lean Startup. I think is a really
I've
good
heard it's
place.
pretty good.
uh, there's and honestly, it is amazing that like the sort of master class of startups and entrepreneurship it is available online. Whether it's the blog post of Mark Andreessen or all the great content from Paul Graham and Y Combinator, or
It's all
your
right there.
work, and like there's so much great stuff out there that is almost like the canon of like entrepreneurship
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
literature. You don't need to go to a school or a college or anything. You just read a bunch of blog posts, and you will be ahead of 99% of the folks out there.
Yeah. Yeah. It's incredible to think how much of that didn't exist 20 years ago.
I would
And
encourage people also to blog. So share your journey, share your story, talk about what you're doing. You'd be surprised by just sharing what you're going through will attract people to
totally. Oh, yeah.
support you or help you or challenge your ideas
Or
or
post in
show
a
you things.
comment on your blog the very thing you wind up spending your life doing.
Absolutely. So I really I know I'm talking my book a little bit, but I think a world where everyone blogs more would be a lot better.
If you had to pick one thing, you had to start over right now, you had to create one open source project or one product, like one thing using all this new technology that you don't have time to do yourself. It's not, not something that Automattic is working on, but something you're like, oh man, if I didn't have all the other things I was doing in my life, I think this would be a fun one. What, do you have a favorite?
That's a good question. So the places my mind goes are one something around music, perhaps. So like maybe a tool for musicians. I like creating things that help creators. So if there were a tool for musicians to maybe share music better or collaborate, this already exists, I'm sure. But like the other thing I think about is home automation. So I
Yeah.
love kind of networking, Wi-Fi, and everything like that.
Yeah. Which is quite
And
a pain, very painful today. Yeah.
it's such a fragmented ecosystem, and it's quite buggy. It's amazing that in 2025, like still the smart light bulbs and the smart TV and everything, they're not so smart. And in fact, some of the experiences has degraded as they've incorporated more technology. So I think that that could be kind of a fun fun area to look into. I think there's a cool open source project there called Home Assistant, actually.
Yeah, I think there is. We'll put a link to the old classic book, The Inmates Are Running the Asylum, which has an entire chapter about what do you get when you cross this with a computer, about how adding computers to everything makes the UI of everything worse. It's hilarious.
It's all computer.
It's all computer, and now I mean that it will seem totally dated, of course, because now everything really is all computer. So may as well make the computers a little easier to use. Okay, well, listen, this was awesome. I want to just really say congratulations on the 20th anniversary. I feel very honored that we got to have this conversation on a special on a special occasion.
Pleasure to celebrate with you and dive into some of the history and lore of Automattic. I don't get a chance to revisit those days as much. So thank you so much for the great questions.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Really good to see you. You've been listening to The Eric Ries Show. The Eric Ries Show is produced by Jordan Bornstein and Kiki Garthwaite. Research by Tom White and Melanie Rehack. Visual design by Reform Collective. Title theme by DB Music. I'm your host, Eric Ries. Thanks for listening and watching. See you next time.